there is a mountain range that refuses to let go of its people's names. For thousands of years, the peaks of the Zagros and the Taurus have watched over one of the oldest continuously inhabited highland regions on Earth. And scattered across that terrain today are surnames, ordinary, familiar, spoken at weddings and funerals and border crossings, that may be quietly encoding something far older than anyone intended. Not just family history, not just tribal memory, possibly a layered genetic story stretching back to the first farmers who ever domesticated wheat. This is not a simple story about a name and a nation. It is a story about what happens when a name, a mountain, and a genome are placed side by side and do not fully agree with each other. For a long time, the explanation for Kurdish identity seemed settled enough. Historians and linguists generally describe the Kurds as an Iranian-speaking people of the Zagros and Taurus Highlands, their language rooted in the broader Iranian branch of the Indo-European family, their identity forged through centuries of Highland pastoralism, tribal confederation, and resistance to the empires that repeatedly tried to absorb them, Persian, Ottoman, Arab, and later, modern nation-states that drew borders straight through the middle of their homeland. Surnames, in this conventional picture, were assumed to function the way surnames often do elsewhere, as labels of geography, occupation, or lineage, attached fairly recently, especially once modern states began requiring formal family names in the 20th century. It was a tidy narrative. A Highland people, an ancient language, a set of names layered on top almost as an administrative afterthought. But the closer researchers looked at the actual texture of Kurdish surnames, and later, at the genetic signatures beneath them, the tidier version began to strain. The first crack was almost invisible. Anthropologists and linguists working across Kurdish-speaking regions noticed that surnames did not distribute evenly or randomly. Names like Barzani and Zabari clustered tightly around specific highland valleys. Names like Herki and Mili mapped onto confederations with long, semi-independent tribal histories, some of which had negotiated with empires as though they were small states in their own right. Names carrying the root, sex, or mir, signaling religious or noble lineage, appeared with striking consistency in regions historically tied to Sufi orders and old feudal structures. And then there were names tied not to Kurmanji or Sorani-speaking populations at all, but to smaller, older linguistic pockets, Zazaki, Huramai, Garani, communities whose language itself seemed to sit on a different branch of the Iranian family tree, older and more isolated than the Kurdish mainstream around them. That last detail mattered more than it first appeared. If Kurdish identity were simply one people, expanding outward from one origin, why did some of its oldest highland communities speak languages that linguists classify as more archaic, more divergent, almost as if they were remnants of an earlier population layer rather than late branches of the same tree? This is where the story stopped being purely historical, and where genetics entered the investigation. Modern population genetics does not read tribal records or oral tradition. It reads the genome itself, the long molecular archive carried in every cell, passed down through mitochondrial DNA along the maternal line, through the Y chromosome along the paternal line, and through the vast recombining landscape of autosomal DNA, which blends ancestry from every branch of a family tree at once. Where surnames and oral history preserve memory selectively, often favoring the paternal line, often shaped by politics and prestige, the genome preserves almost everything, including the parts nobody bothered to remember. And when researchers began sequencing populations across the Zagros Highlands, sampling Kurdish communities alongside neighboring Persian, Armenian, Assyrian, Arab, and Anatolian populations, something unexpected began to surface. The Kurdish Highlands were not genetically flat. They were not a single population wearing different tribal names. They were layered, deeply layered, in a way that echoed the linguistic oddities researchers had already noticed. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where a name on a family tree turns out to be the surface of something much older, consider subscribing, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most inherited stories admit. At the deepest layer, ancient DNA recovered from Zagros Highland sites, some of the earliest farming communities on the planet, revealed a genetic signature that researchers now recognize as one of the foundational populations behind the Neolithic Revolution itself. These were not late arrivals to agriculture. Some of the earliest evidence for domesticated wheat, barley, goats, and sheep comes from precisely this region. And the ancient genomes recovered from Zagros farmers turned out to be genetically distinct from the early farmers of the Levant and Anatolia, a separate, parallel cradle of agricultural origin, not a simple offshoot of a single fertile crescent story. That alone complicated the textbook version of how farming spread across the ancient world. But it also planted a much deeper question inside the Kurdish surname mystery. If a Zagros Highland signature this old still echoes in the region today, how much of it survived, quietly, structurally, inside the modern populations who never left those mountains? The answer, according to researchers working across several population studies, appears to be a significant amount, though unevenly distributed, and blended with everything that arrived afterward. Three explanatory frameworks now sit at the center of this investigation, and no single one fully closes the case. The first is deep continuity, the idea that highland-based communities, protected by difficult terrain and relative isolation, retained a disproportionately strong genetic echo of the original Zagros farming population, resistant to the waves of migration that repeatedly swept through the lowlands around them. The second is layered admixture, the idea that Bronze Age and Iron Age movements, including Iranian-speaking steppe-influenced populations migrating from the north and east, folded into the existing highland base without fully replacing it, creating exactly the kind of stratified, name-correlated genetic pattern researchers now observe. The third, and perhaps the most quietly provocative, is what some researchers describe as a mosaic model, the idea that Kurdish was never one population that expanded, but several distinct highland and semi-isolated groups, speaking related but genuinely divergent languages, that were later drawn together under a shared linguistic and cultural identity, while still carrying meaningfully different ancestral proportions beneath the surface. Each framework explains part of the picture. None of them, on its own, explains all of it. The landmark evidence that pushed this from speculation into serious science came from broader genomic comparison panels, studies that placed Kurdish populations alongside dozens of other Middle Eastern, Caucasian, and Iranian plateau groups within the same analytical framework, using enough genetic markers to detect fine-grained structure rather than broad, blurry categories. What these comparisons revealed was not a single Kurdish genetic cluster. It was several distinguishable subclusters, correlating imperfectly, but noticeably, with geography, with religious minority status, and yes, with certain surname and tribal groupings. Communities associated with older, more isolated linguistic branches, including some Zaza and Gorani-speaking populations, showed genetic signatures suggesting deeper, more localized continuity, sometimes closer to ancient regional baselines than to the broader Kurdish-speaking populations around them. Meanwhile, populations tied to historically dominant tribal confederations, whose surnames spread wide through political power and alliance rather than isolation, showed broader, more blended ancestry profiles, the genetic fingerprint of communities that absorbed neighbors rather than remaining sealed off from them. Here is the twist researchers did not initially expect. It was not simply that Kurdish populations carried ancient Zagros ancestry, mixed with later Iranian and regional input. That much fit the existing framework reasonably well. The twist was where certain isolated highland and minority populations, including some Yazidi communities, whose religious and cultural identity is deeply tied to Kurdish-speaking regions, showed genetic affinities that, in some analyses, pulled distinctly toward very old regional substrates, with less of the later blending visible elsewhere. Not a separate origin invented from nothing. An older layer, preserved with unusual clarity, in populations that history had pushed toward the margins rather than the center. The genome, in other words, was not simply confirming who held power in the more recent past. It was preserving a version of Highland history that predates tribal confederations, predates empires, and in some interpretations, predates the very idea of Kurdish as a single unified category. That does not mean the modern Kurdish identity is false. It means it is layered, built from populations with genuinely different depths of local ancestry, unified over centuries by language, geography, resistance, and shared highland life, rather than by a single genetic point of origin. This is bigger than one surname, or even 15. It reflects something researchers increasingly emphasize about human population history in general. Identity and ancestry are not the same measurement. A name can travel through conquest, marriage, religious conversion, and political alliance far faster than a genome changes. A shared language can unify populations whose deep ancestral layers never fully merged. And a mountain range, rather than isolating one people, can quietly preserve several. Consider, for a moment, the physical landscape itself, because it explains why this pattern exists at all. Picture the high valleys of the Zagros in early spring, when the snowmelt turns narrow mountain paths into temporary rivers, and villages that were cut off for months suddenly reconnect with the outside world. Picture shepherd families following seasonal migration routes their ancestors followed for thousands of years, moving flocks between lowland winter pasture and highland summer pasture, a rhythm called transhumance that has shaped this region since before written history. Picture a landscape folded into ridges and hidden plateaus, where a community 6 valleys over might as well have been on a different continent for most of the last 10,000 years, close enough for trade and marriage in good seasons, distant enough for genetic and linguistic drift to quietly accumulate in isolation. That terrain did not just shelter Kurdish culture from empires. It shaped, valley by valley, a genome that is not one story, but many stories folded against each other like the mountains themselves. So when a name like Barzani, or Zabari, or Herki, or Mili, or Sexani, or Bapyri, or Siziri, or Huramai surfaces on a family tree, it is not delivering a genetic verdict. Surnames are cultural artifacts, shaped by tribal alliance, religious lineage, geography, and centuries of political negotiation, not by DNA. No name alone can prove ancestry. But many of these names sit, quite literally, on top of some of the oldest continuously inhabited highland ground on the planet, ground that ancient genomes suggest helped seed agriculture for a significant portion of the ancient world, and that modern genomes suggest never fully lost that original signature, even as wave after wave of history moved through it. If your name traces back to these mountains, the honest scientific answer is not a simple label. It is an invitation into a layered, still unfinished archive, one that researchers are only beginning to read with the resolution it deserves. The old story treated Kurdish identity as a single line drawn across a map, one people, one language family, one highland homeland. The genome does not erase that story. It widens it, revealing a landscape where deep ancient continuity, later migration, tribal expansion, and quiet isolated preservation all sit layered beneath the same mountains, the same language, and yes, the same names. The map was never wrong, exactly. It was simply too small for what the mountains had actually kept. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson sitting beneath every name on this list, not just for Kurdish highland communities, but for anyone tracing a surname back toward an ancient landscape. A name is a thread, not the whole fabric. It points toward a place, a lineage, a fragment of memory carried forward by people who wanted their children to know where they came from. But underneath that thread, the genome keeps a longer, quieter record, one shaped by mountains and migrations that no single family and no single generation ever fully witnessed. The Kurds were never simply what the old maps suggested. Not because the old maps were dishonest, but because no map that flat could ever hold a history that deep. If stories like this move you, where a name becomes a doorway into 10,000 years of highland memory, stay close, because history keeps turning out to be larger, older, and more human than the version we were first given.